This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I think we're in good shape to record now. Got my hamburger stew cooking in the crock pot. I've managed to stop the nosebleed I've had for the last hour. I'm only on my second cup of coffee, though, so I'm still a little groggy. But I think we'll be able to push through this one and maybe not have to stop the recording so I have to go clean myself up. Weather changes are the absolute worst. I'm telling you, man, I can go like several weeks without getting a nosebleed. As soon as there's a drastic change in temperature, my sinuses go crazy. It's either that or my body's telling me to avoid talking about Retro Raw. There's a science to it that I still haven't figured out yet. But for anybody new to the show, if you're happening to stumble across the channel for the very first time, you are currently tuned into the Five Starr Wrestling Report. It is the wrestling podcast that nobody knows but everybody needs. We are here on YouTube and Rumble Mondays and Fridays for new shows and new discussions. It's a good time to be following our reviews because we're now beginning a brand new year of classic wrestling coverage. And if you're somebody that enjoys wrestling, but you prefer going back and reliving the old classic footage because so much of the modern stuff sucks, this will be the podcast for you. We are in the process of doing deep dives on a wide range of stuff, including NWA World Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, World Class Championship Wrestling. That's all stuff we cover on the Friday show. Today, though, we've got Retro Raw. And boy, was it raw. That's the old 1993 banner coming back to bite us all in the rear. We like it raw. And in the case of Vince McMahon, that's true in more ways than one. But I won't get into all that now. So when thinking about how last week's show filled me with nothing but sorrow and dread, having experienced the WWF Raw Bowl, I still have PTSD just thinking about it. Well, I tried to be a little open-minded a week later, figuring, what the hell. It was a holiday episode last time. Yeah, they still beat Nitro in the ratings, amusingly enough. But the whole show was largely a joke. Maybe they'll get back on track this week and try to actually focus on some Rumble build. Maybe not devote an entire hour to bad football parodying. Well, the good news was they focused a little more on pay-per-view hype this week. The bad news, it's still Raw. So the booking and producing is all over the fucking map. I can at least say there was one promising thing to come out of this week's show, even if the actual execution of the segment was mostly dog shit. I'm referring to the debut of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Even though he wasn't technically Stone Cold Steve Austin yet, but we'll get into it. I'm just trying to whet your appetite a little bit. And I know it's been a while since we've covered all the big stories with Retro Raw from around this time. Just to give you a brief overview and refresher, they're still trying to get over this ridiculous HBK sympathetic concussion / fake retirement story that nobody's buying, excluding all the young, ovulating, easily manipulated women. But I don't even know if the majority of them buy the story. I think they just want Sean to fuck them all. As I've said before, I never liked any of this growing up. Even as a kid, nothing about Shawn Michaels' presentation from around this time ever came off as cool to me. It all just came off like a desperate ploy for attention, which is exactly what it turned out to be in the end. So even as a 9-year-old, I could see right through all this. All the while, in other related news, Bret Hart is still the WWF champion. And as they're gearing up for the big Iron Man match with him and Shawn at Mania, they are also trying to keep Bret preoccupied with other intermediary feuds. He's got Diesel in a cage match in February at the next In Your House, although that's unconfirmed on television by this point. And he's also got The Undertaker in a title match set for the Royal Rumble in a few weeks. And they've done such a remarkable job building up Bret and Taker. Not only was Taker only briefly featured in a pre-tape on this show after barely being on television in months, they also had Bret featured in the main event, which was a replay of a match with Davey Boy from his title match at the December Seasons Beatings In Your House. So yeah, they're doing a wonderful job really building up the heat and tension for that title program. It's almost like they're deliberately trying to put it on ice. Oh, and lest I forget, more importantly than anything else I just covered, got to talk about the new hot free agents that WWF was trying to get over in the early months of '96. And you all know who I'm talking about. We're talking about the Nacho Man, the Huckster, Scheme Gene, and Billionaire Ted. It was such a raging success when they aired the skit at the end of last week's Raw Bowl. Vince figured, let's make them regular returning characters. The people will love it. Billionaire Ted skits, pal. Now that's good shit. Well, it definitely moved the ratings. It moved the ratings in the opposite direction of where they needed to go. And, I don't want to get too bogged down with the whole Billionaire Ted stuff. Everybody openly mocked it at the time, including Bischoff and Hogan on Nitro. I don't need to tell you that the skits sucked. But the whole concept of it was so ludicrous on its face. The idea that Vince was such a staunch believer that his product was so superior to Nitro from around this time, despite the continual fluctuating ratings from week to week, there was no clear-cut definitive advantage for either product around this time. Let's be honest. I know people have a lot of nostalgia for those old Nitro shows. Both programs around this period largely sucked. I think it was just the fact that Nitro was the new show on the block. People were already accustomed to the shitty presentation of WWF booking, so they were badly looking for an alternative. And boy, has that conversation come full circle decades later. And look at the state of WWE's competition today. Competition in air quotes. But beyond the horrible acting and the general goofy presentation of these Billionaire Ted skits, making Ted the stereotypical redneck Southern hillbilly, Hogan and Savage being broken down old-timers whose best days were long behind them, the balding Gene Okerlund trying to sell hotline advertisements. Like, I mean, the fact was, not everything about it is untrue. Ted Turner was kind of a nutcase. Savage and Hogan, yes, they were certainly in the twilight of their careers in terms of what they were able to do in the ring physically by the late 90s. And like Vince's whole defense mechanism here, trying to make everything a comedy sketch in order to avoid lawsuits. But it eventually gets to the point where USA execs start analyzing these Billionaire Ted skits and say, you know, these are starting to look like personal attacks on Ted Turner rather than comedy sketches, which is why the president of the network had to step in eventually and be like, Vince, you can't air these things anymore. Like, this isn't even good faith humor. This is just a personal grudge being broadcast to a nationwide audience. Now, whether or not I agree with that assertion, that's kind of irrelevant. I mean, I never saw them as personal attacks from Vince. I just thought the comedy skits fucking sucked. Because they did. They weren't funny in the slightest. But either way, it was the right move to do away with them. I mean, those segments died on the vine every time they aired one. Of course, the amazing blow-off with everything at WrestleMania 12's pre-show where they book all the gimmick parodies in a match and everybody dies from heart attacks. Super classy, I know. The Vince McMahon way. I honestly don't even know where I was going with that whole tangent. I think I started talking about the irony of Vince believing Raw was so much better than Nitro. He had to construct this entire parody model just to throw it back in Turner's face. Meanwhile, WWF was about to head into a ratings tailspin by the summer of this year, while Nitro's ratings soared for the next 83 straight weeks. How's that for irony? And by the way, in case you were all curious, since we're talking about the ratings, Raw did beat Nitro for the second straight week to kick off the new year. They did a 3.0 to Nitro's 2.8. But again, man, it's like I just said with the Billionaire Ted stuff. You know, Vince standing on his moral high ground and thinking his product was so superior to Nitro. Meanwhile, they're basically neck and neck in terms of viewership. And we'll talk about next week's ratings when we get there. That was a real eye-opener. I guess we should try to talk a little bit about this show. Not that there's much to discuss. They open with Jeff Jarrett versus Hakushi. It's technically Double J's first TV match back since his return at In Your House in December, which they actually replayed during the inset here. They showed the entire brawl sequence where Ahmed no-sold all of Jarrett's heat and then made his own comeback. Fucking absurd. God, Ahmed was terrible. I mean, the match is all right. Double J's a good old school Southern worker. He always knows how to slow things down as a heel and work the crowd a little bit. I did like the point in the match where Jarrett legitimately fucked up a swinging neck breaker and then got up and said, "That's how you do it right there." I laughed. I honestly don't even know why. Probably because Double J's a heel, and it's entirely plausible that a heel would screw up his own move, but still pat himself on the back after the fact. But either way, it was funny. Still never got the whole Akushi thing. I mean, the guy was a decent athlete, but he was more boring than a plate full of piss to watch. Predictably, Jarrett wins after Akushi goes up and misses a splash. Double J gets the knees up and then slaps on a figure four for the submission. And then afterwards, he picked up his guitar and surprisingly did not break it over Akushi's head. Which meant that I couldn't make my Mike Graham 6,000 guitars broken, never drew a fucking dime comment. Just like his new record album. Not a fucking dime drawn. Meanwhile, here we sit in the year 2025. Jarrett is about to go on his retirement tour in AEW to try to become world champion. That is a thing that is going on, apparently. Hey, you know what? 20 to 30 years ago, I'd probably be having a mental breakdown over that possibility. These days, it doesn't seem entirely preposterous. I am so glad I gave up on AEW when I did, dog. Here I am in December, thinking to myself, yeah, maybe I should give him a second chance. How bad could it possibly be? Immediately starting the new year with Jeff fucking Jarrett trying to pursue a major singles world title. I'm like, what the fuck is this? Am I watching WCW 2000 all over again? I don't even want to see that shit back then. Or in TNA. God, we're still talking about slapnuts all these years later. Just the embodiment of every mid-30s fan's nightmare. Jeff fucking Jarrett in main event pictures getting world title shots. Being pounded down people's throats left and right. How many times do we have to experience that growing up? And now in 2025, it doesn't look all that far-fetched. Hell, I'd say go for it. Better him than the fucking Valvoline associate Moxley at this point. So after a quick Royal Rumble card update with Jim Ross and Scheme Gene, we pitch back to the ring for a somewhat painless Ahmed Johnson squash. And by that, I mean he still nearly killed the guy. It was just short, so it was tolerable. He wrestled some geek named Jeff Rattler, who I believe was wearing my mom's living room curtains for pants. Here's what I wrote down. Saito suplex from Ahmed, I think. Terrible looking short-armed lariat. A scissors kick where he yet again used his left foot to come down on the guy's back, despite him being positioned to the right of Ahmed's body. Still doesn't make any fucking sense to me. Spinebuster, Pearl River Plunge, 1, 2, 3. I said, somewhat painless. We're grading on the Ahmed Johnson scale. I should also mention the brief afterbirth where Double J tried and failed to run down and break his guitar over Ahmed, but instead he hit the top of the ring post and broke off the headstock. And then Ahmed went ahead and destroyed the guitar anyway. So in fact, I am able to use the famous Mike Graham quote. What guitar count was that for Jarrett by this point? 1,452. Plenty more where that came from over the years. And the result was always the same. Not one ticket sold. Not one dime drawn. And then we move on to the big topic of discussion for the week. A segment they did not advertise in advance. And while this particular gimmick incarnation was death from day one, well, the guy behind the gimmick seemed to do pretty well for himself a year or two later. Now, for anybody that doesn't know the whole backstory to Steve Austin's WWF debut, his journey began here in January of 1996 as the ringmaster, the protege of Ted DiBiase. He had just come off being fired from WCW the year prior when Eric Bischoff didn't really see him as a marketable main eventer. And, well, obviously I don't really need to provide any context to that. It was a pretty momentous blunder on Bischoff's part. You know, at the same time, Bischoff never booked or promoted Steve Austin in WCW as a main event talent. I mean, his biggest claim to fame was when he beat Dustin Rhodes at Starrcade 93 for the U.S. title. I think he had a brief stint in ECW right before signing with Vince in like December of 95. And I don't think he did any house show or dark matches prior to his debut. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that. I think this was his first appearance in front of a WWF audience. And of course, everybody remembers that the Ringmaster gimmick was a complete flop. Like, even when Austin made his debut here in 96, he still had the blonde buzz cut and no goatee. I mean, he hadn't even shaved his head to look more like Stone Cold by this point. Presentation, looks-wise, it just never clicked. But holy cow, when Steve got a chance to cut a promo and work that stick magic, I think that's when a lot of smarter fans watching at the time said, this guy's got something. He can talk his ass off. And like, that's the most baffling thing to me about the Ringmaster gimmick. Even to this day, like, it was clearly Stone Cold Steve Austin talking here, other than him finishing off sentences with man way too frequently, plus a copious amounts of swearing and redneck slang. But it had all the Stone Cold cadences, the Stone Cold inflections, the Stone Cold delivery. It just wasn't quite Stone Cold. But the guy could talk. And that was always a natural gift for Steve. It just took a bit longer for him to fully adapt into the version of Steve Austin that everybody remembers. And as far as the whole alliance with Ted and the $1 Million Championship, I mean, on the surface, I didn't think DiBiase and Austin together was a bad idea. I don't really think Austin needed a mouthpiece or a manager per se. He could already carry himself comfortably upon arrival. But if they had more of a clear-cut idea of what they wanted to do with Austin under DiBiase's wing, they probably could have made something work. It's just not really worth ranting about extensively because by the time we get past the Royal Rumble, they're going to quietly drop the Ringmaster gimmick and then start incorporating the Stone Cold nickname into Austin's TV matches. And by that period, he'll have already shaved his head and started growing out his goatee. So, this is kind of one of those blimp-on-the-radar personas that I think people often remember as being terrible, but, I mean, it was so abrupt. can you really even call it terrible? Didn't really leave much of a legacy. But Steve Austin has arrived. And as we'll come to learn over time, he's about to become, well, not only one of the building block foundations for the WWF over the next 5 to 6 years, he's also about to become one of my favorite guys to watch on television from week to week. You know who wasn't one of my favorite guys to watch on television from around this point? Goldust. He's becoming more homoerotic as the weeks progress. And that's not even me trying to make a distasteful joke. That is literally what they're doing with this Razor Ramon feud. The entire story is Goldust wants to fuck Razor, and despite Razor not showing any interest, Goldust continually tries to pursue him. You know what we call that nowadays? Harassment. In 1996, they just called that bizarre behavior. Anyway, he wrestled Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese panty man. Vince informed us here that Goldust has, and I quote, great grappling skills. Also that his favorite movie is Heat, starring Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. The sex jokes write themselves. So Montoya made a short comeback, got cut off by Goldust, who won with a reverse DDT. And then it was immediately to the back, Mike Tenay style, for a pre-tape press conference in Fresno, California, featuring Shawn Michaels. And to make a long story short, this is where HBK confirmed that, against family and doctor's orders, he is going to compete in the 1996 Royal Rumble, and he will main event WrestleMania for the World Wrestling Federation Championship. And he will carry the company on his shoulders and simultaneously run the product into the ground with his bullshit unprofessionalism. Whoops, I said the quiet part out loud. Too far. I just like the idea that, of all places for Shawn to make this announcement, Fresno, California? The fuck? Not even San Antonio. Fresno. I just imagine how different this all would have played out if he'd have come out to do the announcement live. That's what I didn't get about this whole thing. He didn't do this on Raw in front of 8,000 people. He got a mild popcorn fart reaction from like 5 press journalists and an audience of 20. In a small conference room. Can you just imagine how different that would have come off if he would have done it live in the venue? Like, why the hell wouldn't they have just done that? Came off so lame. But of course, we all know what it's leading to in a few weeks, so I won't belabor the conversation. A couple of other guys did pre-taped insets talking about Shawn. Diesel basically put him over, but said if it comes down to him and Shawn, Diesel won't hesitate to throw him out. Which, if I recall, I think the final 2 end up being Shawn and Diesel, correct? Unless I'm misremembering that. Razor did a semi-heel promo basically saying that Shawn's coming back too early. But then he just turns around and says, but if Shawn's in it, he'll win. Which was bizarre. And then Owen got to chime in, basically vowing that he nearly ended Shawn's career in the first place. and he promises he'll put him out for good. And I think this also sets up the match between those two at the In Your House in February. And as far as the main event goes, the replay of Davey Boy versus Bret Hart for the WWF title at In Your House. I mean, I'm not going to spend 15 minutes dissecting the match again. You can just go listen to my In Your House 5 review if you want the full breakdown. It was still a great match. Other than me making a mockery of Diana Hart's horrible acting, the work between Davey and Bret was awesome. I wasn't exactly sure what the point of re-airing the match was. It did virtually nothing to promote the Royal Rumble match with Taker. It's still a match I recommend people go out of their way to seek out if you've never seen it. You know, it's sad too, because I think it's one of those matches that gets lost in the shuffle over time, especially when you think about Bret's feud with Davey Boy. Like, people immediately refer to the SummerSlam 92 match in Wembley. And to be fair, it was a much bigger attraction match at that point when they did it then versus 3 years later for what was essentially a glorified house show pay-per-view. But shit, dude. You know, I'm thinking back to a lot of the matches we reviewed in 95. Yeah, it was probably one of the better ones. The bar wasn't set all that high to begin with. I'm actually shocked they aired this on television, what with the graphic nature of Bret gigging himself here. Not that USA had a ban on the use of blood on television or anything, but considering where the WWF was still at here in 96, trying to gear more towards a family-friendly product, it did seem a little out of sorts for them to air something like this. And to be fair, they did have Paul Bearer and Taker in an inset promo to briefly talk about the upcoming match. It's another one of those weird dichotomies where you have Bret versus Taker. It's essentially a babyface versus babyface match. And, you know, because of the fact that there's no real heat for it, it doesn't really help its case. I sort of remember that match offhand. It's definitely not one of the better Bret Taker matches. SummerSlam 97 was way better. But again, as a holdover program to keep Bret busy until Mania. I mean, I definitely wasn't going to complain about a match with Taker. Better him than fucking Mabel. And to close things out, they aired another crappy Billionaire Ted skit that just made me want to jump out a 10-story window. And this one was all about slogans. Moreover, it was about exposing the hypocrisy of drug testing between WCW and WWF around this time. And of course, the comedy here is that Hogan and Savage weren't in the WWF anymore, so they didn't have to worry about mandatory drug testing. Which was also humorous in that I think this is around the point where WCW had dropped the "Where the Big Boys Play" tagline. Because, well, yeah. The implications were a little drastic. Not saying they were all on the gas, just a good portion of them. By the way, them also airing this parody skit around the same time Shawn Michaels was coked out of his fucking mind. Dude. You want to talk about hypocrisy? And that wasn't even the worst part of this whole thing. Fuck. Another Vince Russo cameo. Just shoot me now. By the way, did you know there's a Royal Rumble pay-per-view coming up in less than 3 weeks? Yeah, you'd barely know that based on the way these shows have been booked. The most we've been getting is JR plugging all the graphics of the various names that have entered the Rumble match. It's literally just a hodgepodge of underneath guys and random returns like Jake the Snake Roberts and Doug Gilbert. I knew about Jake. I completely forgot that Doug Gilbert made an appearance in this thing. Meanwhile, they're spending more time building up Goldust and Razor's love affair than anything they've done with Brett and Taker for the WWF title. We got to get our priorities in order, brother. We know what the real drawing card is. I know we're still in the early stages of 96. I promise you. Things do eventually get better to a degree, but yeah, this new year is not off to a good start. Oh, and when I say things get better, I mean in about 18 months. We've got a ways to go. But as we look ahead here, I know we still got, I think, 2 more weeks until the 96 Rumble. I also had to remind myself they ran these pay-per-views a lot earlier. Because I think I looked it up the other day. 2025 Rumble isn't even until like February 1st, right? So there's definitely a gap. And if I can type, it would help immensely. January 21st. Okay, so yeah, that's 2 weeks out from now. And then we have the 2025 Royal Rumble, which is, just to double check myself because I don't trust myself, February 1st. Yep. So that's 3 more weeks out. Well, that'll wrap up this one here. So next week will be the official Go Home edition. Hopefully we'll rack up some enthusiasm for some of these programs because they are not doing a very good job as of late. But that'll do it for now, everybody, and make sure you stop back on Friday to check out the continuation of the Retro Review series. And I'll catch you all soon. Take care. Peace out.